The Lord be with you. This is a reading of the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left the district where they were and began to journey through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples in this vein. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men who will put him to death. 3 days after his death, he will rise. Though his disciples failed to understand his words, they were afraid to question Jesus. They returned to Capharnaum, and Jesus, once inside the house, began to ask them, "What were you discussing on the way home?" And at this they fell silent, for on the way home they had been arguing about who was the most important. So Jesus sat down and called the 12 around him and said, "If any one of you wishes to rank first, then you must remain the last of all and servant of all." And then he took a little child and stood the child in their midst, and putting his arms around the child, said to them, "Whoever welcomes a child, such as this child, for my sake, welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not just me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The harvest of justice is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. About 25 years ago, when Visitation had become a sister parish with Mary, Mother of the Poor in San Salvador. There's room up front here. Did you know this is a Catholic church? We always have room in the front pews. Okay. I won't bite this morning. I'm medicated now. Is this being recorded? Anyway. At Visitation, we had formed this relationship of a sister parish with Madre de los Pobres in San Salvador, and so we began making these annual pilgrimages, delegations there to spend a week with the community, and we went down in groups of other delegations from other sister parishes, and so we got to not only visit our own, but we got to visit some others, and on this one particular trip we went, and usually we went out into the campo and into the countryside and visited some of the villages which had other sister parishes in them, and this particular one, unfortunately I don't remember the name of the town right now, but as you drive into any one of these villages, you pass by their graveyard on the way in, and these are always walled with an adobe wall as you come in. And in this particular one, as we were driving by, it looked like there was graffiti on the wall, and so I initially, had a negative response of thinking about graffiti, kind of defiling the graveyard and whatever. But as we drove and as I looked at what was on the wall, it was really a story And it was literally a story of a very horrible event that had happened. And the whole time that we were a sister parish, when I was there at visitation, El Salvador was still in a civil war between the soldiers of the government and the rebels. And earlier in the war, this village had been the site of a massacre of the soldiers coming in and killing unarmed men, women, and children. And literally what was on the wall in pictures was this story of this massacre. And so it was really a horrible visual to have as we were coming in. And then when we got to the center of the town where the church was, there was men up on scaffolding all around the outside of the church, which had been riddled with bullets and bombs. And so literally they were repairing their church as we were coming in. And so when we sat down with the leaders of the church, of the village, we sat down to hear the story of what had happened. And that literally those who were there by the time we got there had been the ones who had actually fled and survived the massacre, and the village and the surrounding area had been abandoned for some time, but eventually they chose to come back, and literally to come back and to rebuild their village and their farms and their lives from scratch. And in doing so, they had made a very fundamental choice that was based upon this verse of James 3:18, that the harvest of justice is sown in peace for those who cultivate peace. And what they chose to do is to together make this vow of nonviolence, and that's how they would live, even in the midst of a civil war, and that's what they would teach their children and their children's children, is to live a vow of nonviolence and to cultivate peace, and to do that in prayer. And in faith and trust in God, that ultimately there would be a harvest of justice, even if it wasn't in their own lifetime, a harvest of justice within their own country. So every time I come by this verse, then my obviously that memory comes back very clearly and very strikingly to me. And a little bit earlier, just a line or two earlier, James talks about a special kind of wisdom that is essential to be a sower of peace. In Spanish, that's Sembradores de la Paz. They even had a T-shirt with that written on it. And before I got older and fatter, I could wear my T-shirt, but I can't do it anymore. But that was their mantra, is to become a sower of peace, is what they were trying to do. But James says but to do that, you need a wisdom that literally is of divine origin and not just human origin, and a wisdom that first of all is innocent. Which of course makes you wonder how possible that is. Amen. I mean, how many innocent people do we have over at the age of 9 in here at this point? Yeah. So I mean, I don't ever look at myself as innocent, but that verse challenges us that to become that is basically to become more innocent than we are. This led to another teaching that I had heard recently when I was driving my truck instead of my Jeep, which is too old to have a CD player, and so it had a cassette player. Well, all my Dr. Martin Luther King sermons are on cassettes; they're not on CDs. And so I was, trucking around with Martin for a few days, and listening to his sermons. And there was one sermon I don't remember ever listening to before, and it was his sermon, or probably what happened is I listened to it and then I shelved it because it is a sermon specifically on loving your enemies. Okay? Which he had plenty of practice, amen, of learning how to love your enemies. And which is the teaching of Jesus coming from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7. And so he gave this teaching literally on how do you do that? How do you begin to love your enemies? Okay? And there were, and I've got to go back and listen to it again so I can memorize the whole sermon. But what I remember right now is at least 3 of the 5 or 6 steps that he gave of how do you learn to love your enemies. And he said the first step is you start with yourself. The first step is to start with yourself. Is there something that you're doing or not doing that is creating this friction, that is creating this problem between you and your enemy? So he boiled it down to something that is interpersonal and a relationship that is not good, but it is a relationship. If you have an enemy and that's an enemy to you and you're an enemy to that person, that's a relationship, amen, isn't it? It's a negative one, it's a toxic one, but it's a relationship. And so boiling it down to that relationship level, he says, first of all, look to yourself and say, is there something that I have done or not done or am doing or not doing that is creating that or is feeding that? Okay, so he said start with yourself before you go to the person. So literally, it's the wisdom that is innocent. So you literally start with yourself, and you try to create a greater innocence with regards to this relationship, which is toxic. Okay, and then he said the second thing is then you've got to look at the person with different eyes to try to see some good that's there. So instead of just looking at the bad, looking at the part that makes this person an enemy, try to look for the good that is not that, okay? That you're not seeing or you're not appreciating enough. If all you're seeing is enemy, then you're not seeing that there could really be some good in this. I mean, if they're a human being, they're created in the image and likeness of God just as you are. Jesus died for them just as he died for you, so there must be something that is lovable there, okay? So he said that would be a second step. After you've looked inside yourself and after you've tried to purify your own attitudes, your own actions, he said, then look for something, a place to start. A place to start of looking for some good in the person. That is already there. That is already there. And the third step I remember is to then look for the potential for good that is there. So it may not be actualized yet, but is it there potentially? Okay, can you see the potential for good in this person, which you have not yet seen, because they're an enemy. So you're not seeing any good in them at all, and you're not seeing any potential for good. So look for the good that already is, and then to look for the potential that is not yet. And when I got to that point in the sermon, that led me back to another teaching by another wise man, Viktor Frankl, who's survivor of Auschwitz, who also had plenty of practice about loving enemies. So that's literally where you have to go. You have to go to people who are more practiced and therefore have more wisdom to offer than you do. And so what Viktor Frankl was saying is that true love anytime you say, I have true love for this or that person, that you really are not only loving them for who they already are, you are loving them for who they can be, who they can become. Okay? So you're loving the potential, and in loving the potential, you empower that person to reach the potential. Okay? Now, that's probably easiest seen in kids. Amen. And parents and grandparents with kids, is because that's what you're seeing and loving is their potential, is their ability that needs to be nurtured and fostered and affirmed, okay? And so, but the same principle can work between and among adults. It's okay. I am not a parent, so I don't know if it's easier or not. I'll stop here. I reached the edge of my experience right here. I would think it would be easier to do with children than with other adults, but I don't know. Would you care to weigh in on that? Oh, with him, yeah. Well, all of those, right? Yeah, that pew, sure. Yeah. Okay, can grandchildren they can do no wrong in the eyes of grandparents, is that it? Gotcha, okay, all right. Anyway, so between James, between Martin, between Victor, we have some real challenging teaching, but I believe we have a challenging teaching that we already have access to that. We're already doing that on some levels, okay? And that's where we need to build. We need to build on the level where we are to try to reach the level where we're not yet. Amen? Amen.